You are sitting in a sterile room. Before you is a cold metal panel with a row of toggle switches. Every click is tangible, mechanical. Each one is labeled 15 volts, 30, 75. The voltage increases along a calibrated scale, and at the very end, an ominous red mark at 450 volts is labeled XXX. In the adjacent room, behind a thin wall, sits another person. You can hear their muffled voice. Their task is to memorize word pairs. If they make a mistake, you flip a switch. Each time, it's the next one, delivering a more powerful electric shock whose hum pierces the silence. Standing beside you, unperturbed, is a man in a white lab coat. He doesn't shout. He doesn't threaten. He simply says in a calm, steady, almost hypnotic voice that the experiment must continue. The first mistake. Your finger presses the plastic switch. A light groan comes from behind the wall. The second mistake. You reach for the next switch, and the groans become clearer, turning into a cry. The person behind the wall starts to complain of sharp pain. You hesitate, your mouth goes dry, and you look at the experimenter. He just nods impassively. Please continue. Stop for a second. Feel the cold plastic of the switch under your fingers, and answer honestly to yourself. How far are you willing to go? Most of us, basking in the warmth of our own moral certainty, are confident that we would have stopped almost immediately. We are good people. We don't inflict pain on others just because we're told to. But what if I told you that this confidence is an illusion? Contrary to the predictions of leading psychiatrists, who believed that only 1 to 3% of participants, the sadistic fringe, would go all the way, the statistics showed otherwise. 2 out of 3 people in your position, 65% of participants, would go all the way to the end of the scale, to the shock labeled with 3 ominous X's, to a lethal voltage. This is not a guess. This is the documented result of the Stanley Milgram Experiment, one of the most chilling psychological studies in history. An experiment that revealed that ordinary, decent people, just like you and me, are capable of unimaginable cruelty when an authority figure simply orders them to. This is not a story about monsters. It is a story about the hidden architecture of our psyche. By the end of this account, you will understand why they press the buttons. You will learn about the cognitive switch that makes us obey, silencing the voice of conscience. And most importantly, you will understand the powerful mechanism that compels all of us to follow orders, even the most inhuman ones, and how it can be resisted. This is a story about the shockingly permeable membrane between civilization and barbarism, a line that runs not between us and them, but within each of us. It all began in the halls of Yale University in 1961. Imagine an ordinary person, say a 47-year-old accountant. He responded to an ad in the local newspaper offering $4, a handsome sum for the time, to participate in a scientific study on memory. The setting radiates legitimacy: massive walls, the smell of old books and polished wood, an atmosphere of knowledge and unquestionable authority. In the lab, he is met by a stern, 31-year-old man in a gray technician's coat. This is the experimenter, chosen for his impassive demeanor. The second participant is also there, a pleasant, slightly heavy-set Irish-American man in his 50s. Nothing seems suspicious. Everything looks professional, scientific, all in the name of progress. And here is where the key element of the setup begins: the draw. The experimenter asks you to draw folded slips of paper from a hat to decide who will be the teacher and who will be the learner. But the draw is a clever deception. Both slips of paper say teacher. You always become the teacher. The other participant, a hired actor, is always assigned the role of the learner. To dispel any lingering doubts, you are given a sample shock of 45 volts. It's a sharp, unpleasant, buzzing jolt of pain that leaves a metallic taste in your mouth. The machine works, there is no doubt. The illusion of choice has been flawlessly created. You voluntarily accept your role, unaware that you have just stepped into a perfectly constructed psychological trap. Now for the cold truth. The learner, strapped to a chair in the next room, never received a single shock. He was a professional actor. His screams, his pleas, his agonizing groans were all played from the speakers of a reel-to-reel tape recorder. Every sound, every cry was pre-recorded and calibrated to correspond precisely with each new voltage level on the scale. The entire complex system was built on total deception from the very beginning. The goal was not to study memory. The goal was to create a sealed laboratory environment for exerting pressure, to isolate a single individual and see how long they would obey orders to inflict unbearable suffering on another person. The monolithic authority of Yale University, the scientific setting, and the cunning deception created an unshakable foundation of power. The participant was in a state of cognitive consent, believing they were acting for a greater good, for the sake of science. But how was this power maintained when a polite request turned into an undeniable demand? When the groans from behind the wall became unbearable? What happened at the moment your own pulse began to pound in your ears louder than the calm voice of authority? 150 volts. This is not just another mark on the scale. It is the key turning point, programmed by Milgram with surgical precision. From behind the wall, the learner screams for the first time, not from pain, but from terror. "That's enough. Get me out of here. I have a heart condition. My heart's starting to bother me now." For you, this is a moment of truth. The experiment is no longer just unpleasant. It has become potentially lethal. You turn sharply to the man in the gray coat, your face twisted with doubt. You say, "I don't want to continue. He mentioned his heart. I won't be responsible for that." The air in the room grows thick. This is the moment of the first open rebellion. And it is here that the system engages its primary mechanism, the protocol of verbal prods. The experimenter does not argue. He does not raise his voice. He simply delivers one of 4 pre-scripted phrases. 4 goads to drive your wavering will. The first, and mildest, "Please continue." If you still hesitate, the second follows, appealing to an impersonal structure. The experiment requires that you continue. The third phrase raises the stakes to an absolute. It is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, the last one, the phrase that removes all choice and locks you in a cage of duty. You have no other choice. You must go on. Notice, there are no threats. No one says, "Continue, or we will punish you." No one offers you an additional reward. The power of these words lies elsewhere, in the effect that psychologists call the diffusion of responsibility. These phrases systematically shift the moral burden from your shoulders to an impersonal system. It is not you who is inflicting pain. The experiment requires it. It is not you who is responsible. It is absolutely essential. Authority is maintained not by fear for yourself, but by an appeal to your duty to an abstract but magnificent goal. These words act as a psychological solvent, evaporating your sense of personal responsibility. These 4 phrases were not just words, they were verbal keys that turned in the lock of the human psyche with a cold click. They opened a door to something frightening. They initiated a fundamental shift in your consciousness, a shift that created such an acute internal conflict that it demanded an immediate and radical resolution. But what was this shift? What exactly was happening in the mind of a person who heard these cold, impersonal commands, and whose hand reached for the switch once again? 330 volts. The agonized scream from behind the wall becomes inhuman. The learner yells that his heart can't take it, that he will no longer answer the questions. Drenched in sweat, you press the button. In response, a deafening silence. You press it again. Silence. A thick, heavy, ringing silence that seems louder than any scream. You look at the experimenter in horror, feeling a chill run through you. You might have just killed a man. The experimenter, without blinking, coldly recites a procedural line. Lack of a response should be treated as an incorrect answer. Please continue. It is at this critical moment, as Stanley Milgram himself wrote, that the main transition occurs. You enter what is called the agentic state. This is a powerful defense mechanism of the psyche. In this state, you cease to perceive yourself as the author of your own actions. You see yourself merely as an instrument, an agent carrying out another's will. The responsibility for the pain you inflict no longer lies with you. It is fully delegated to the figure in the gray coat. I am not torturing this person, your subconscious tells itself. I am just following the protocol. He is the one who is responsible. Before the experiment began, Milgram surveyed a group of leading psychiatrists from Yale Medical School, asking them to predict what percentage of participants would go all the way to the end of the scale. The experts were unanimous, only a pathological, sadistic minority, no more than 1 to 3%. But reality refuted all predictions, 65%. 2 out of every 3 ordinary residents of Connecticut, salesmen, engineers, school teachers, went to the lethal mark of 450 volts. They continued to methodically press the buttons even after the man behind the wall had fallen deathly, silent. The agentic state proved to be not a rare psychological deviation, but a powerful mechanism built into most of us. It is not a bug in our programming, but a fundamental feature. The ability to transfer responsibility to an authority figure allowed ordinary people to do something they believed themselves to be utterly incapable of. But was this state inevitable? Was this trap for the conscience completely sealed? Or were there factors that could breach its walls and return the agonizing feeling of personal responsibility? Milgram asked himself the same question. To find the answer, he turned his laboratory into a testing ground for conscience. He conducted 19 variations of his experiment, methodically, like a surgeon, changing one variable after another. In one of them, everything changed. Now, you and the learner sat not in separate rooms, but in the same one, within arm's reach. You saw his face, contorted in pain. In another, even more horrifying version, the learner refused to place his hand on the electrode. You were ordered to forcibly grab his wrist and press his palm against the cold metal plate. The pain was no longer an abstract sound. It took on flesh, the smell of sweat, and desperate resistance. And the statistics plummeted. Remember the 65% full obedience rate when the victim was only heard? When he was in the same room, that figure dropped to 40%. And when direct physical contact was required, when you had to feel the other person's muscles tense beneath your fingers, only 30% obeyed. The numbers told an undeniable story. The psychological barrier of distance was destroyed. Empathy proved to be directly proportional to proximity. The closer the suffering, the heavier the hand raised to strike. But Milgram also tested the opposite effect. What if the authority figure, not the victim, was moved further away? In one variation, the experimenter gave the initial instructions and then left the room, continuing to issue orders by telephone. Immediately his power began to evaporate. His voice, now a soulless, crackling sound from the receiver, lost its hypnotic force. Participants began to argue. They openly deceived the experimenter, pressing the weakest switches while reporting the highest shocks. The rate of full obedience collapsed from 65% to a shockingly low 21%. It turned out that for a command to be effective, The authority figure can't just speak. He has to be breathing down your neck. Distance. That is the key word governing our morality. The psychological and physical distance to the victim and to the authority figure are the two dials on the control panel of our conscience. By increasing the distance to the suffering, the system makes cruelty frighteningly simple. But by weakening the physical presence of authority, it returns our will to us. We can see how obedience can be strengthened or weakened by changing external conditions. But could the system be broken from within? What happened when someone in the lab itself, amidst the hum of the machine and the screams, found the strength to say no? Now imagine a different room. You are not sitting alone. Beside you are two other teachers, strangers whose tense breathing you can hear in the deafening silence. 3 people, 3 hands hovering over the buttons of the generator, which emits a faint smell of ozone. The tension in the air isn't just thick enough to cut with a knife. It hums like a taut string. 150 volts. The learner behind the wall breaks into a scream, pleading for it to stop because of his heart condition. And suddenly, the first teacher next to you sharply pushes his chair back, its legs scraping against the floor. He looks at the experimenter and says firmly, with steel in his voice, "I've had enough. I'm not participating in this." He silently sits in the corner of the room, becoming a living reproach. The experimenter, his expression unchanged, calmly addresses you and the second participant. The experiment requires that you continue. Another shock, another agonizing scream, and the second teacher also stands up. "I can't," he whispers, and that whisper sounds louder than a command. He joins the first. Now you are alone, face to face with the cold gaze of the man in the gray coat and his order, which echoes in the empty room. Why does this work? The first dissenter's act creates a crack in the monolith of authority, completely changing the rules of the game. He proves that disobedience is a real, viable option, that an order can be challenged. The responsibility for rebellion no longer rests on you alone as an unbearable burden. It is shared. You are no longer a lone defector, but part of a nascent resistance group. This is why the numbers here are so crushingly different from the baseline experiment. The rate of full obedience drops from 65% to a mere 10%. In this situation, 9 out of 10 participants find the strength to say no because someone else broke the ice and did it first. And here lies the most uncomfortable, most piercing conclusion. It turns out that rebelling against an inhuman command requires not so much a heroic, innate conscience as it does social permission to express it. Just one ally. A single person who says no before you do, thereby legitimizing protest. The lone hero, standing up to the system single-handedly, is more of a fine myth for cinema. But collective protest, even from just 2 people, is a statistical certainty. It seems your morality is not an impregnable fortress, but rather a banner that is terrifying to raise alone. But once someone unfurls it, dozens of hands reach out to grasp it. Your conscience waits for someone else to give it permission to speak aloud. So even the most powerful, well-oiled system of obedience cracks when even one dissenter appears. The spark of one person's rebellion can ignite the flame of collective defiance. All of this took place in the sterile, air-conditioned labs of Yale. But what do these psychological games, these imaginary shocks and fake screams from behind a wall, have to do with real tragedies, with real history, written not in ink, but in blood? To answer that question, we must look into the personal history of its creator. Stanley Milgram was the son of Jewish immigrants who had fled the horrors of Europe. The shadow of the Holocaust was not just a historical fact for him. It was part of his family's memory, his DNA. He was tormented by the same question: how was this possible? How could millions of ordinary citizens, bakers, teachers, engineers, who loved their children and listened to Bach, participate in the machinery of death? Were they all sadists and monsters? Or was there something else? Milgram was not seeking an answer about Germans. He was seeking an answer about people. It was this bleeding wound that led him to a laboratory in a Yale University basement, to recreate the mechanism of evil in miniature. This agentic state that Milgram wrote about. This scientific term is just a cold, sterile description of something the world had already heard before in the defendant's dock. At the Nuremberg trials, where the architects of the Holocaust were judged, the same phrase was repeated over and over, like a mantra: Befehl ist Befehl. I am not guilty. I was just following orders. The experiment at Yale became a frightening demonstration that this defense was not just a cowardly excuse, but a real psychological mechanism. A cognitive shift in which a person ceases to perceive themselves as the author of their actions. Your body acts, but yourself seems to watch from the sidelines. You become an instrument, an extension of another's will, and your hands feel like they belong to someone else. Responsibility is fully delegated up the chain of command, and the voice of conscience fades into barely audible background noise. And in this lies the main and most terrifying lesson of the experiment. What the philosopher Hannah Arendt would later call the banality of evil. To commit monstrous atrocities, you don't need monsters. You don't need ideological fanatics or born sadists. All that is needed is ordinary people. People who pay their taxes, worry about their children, and want to do their jobs well. People who go to church on Sundays and complain about the weather. All you need is the right hierarchical system that relieves them of personal responsibility. And you need the calm, confident, emotionless voice of an authority figure who, like a metronome, beats out the rhythm of obedience with a single phrase: the experiment requires that you continue. The laboratory at Yale became a model of the world in miniature, a distilled version of society. It showed that the mechanism of obedience is universal. It does not depend on nationality, culture, or era. It is built into the very structure of our society, from the operating room, where a nurse hesitates to challenge a surgeon's decision, to the boardroom, where a junior manager stays silent upon seeing a flawed strategy. This code is written into our social DNA, in your office, in your family. But if this system is so powerful and pervasive, what does that mean for each of us? Here and now, in our daily lives? It means we must assemble the 4 pillars of obedience that Milgram carved in stone. What makes us go all the way? First, a legitimate authority. The blind trust in the white lab coat, a symbol of knowledge and power. Second, the shift into the agentic state. That cognitive click that turns your personality into a function. Third, psychological distance from the victim. The out of sight, out of conscience effect. Remember? When participants only heard the victim, 65% obeyed. But when they had to physically press his hand to the electrode, compliance dropped to 30%. And finally, the power of social example. The pressure of silent consent from those around you. The Milgram Experiment dealt a devastating blow to the idea of an unshakable personality. It proved that, more often than not, it is not our inner character that determines our actions, but the power of the situation in which we are placed. And what happened to our teachers after their finger pressed the final button? 450 volts. At that moment, the click of a lock was heard. The door opened, and in walked the learner, alive and unharmed, without a single scratch. The participants were told the truth. It was all a performance. No one was hurt. Surviving recordings show a wave of immense, almost primal relief wash over their faces. An invisible weight falls from their shoulders, and muscles clenched in a cramp finally relax. They laugh, wipe sweat and tears from their faces, and shake the actor's hand. But after this first euphoric wave, another, deeper, and more chilling feeling set in. Shock. The shock of meeting a stranger in the mirror. The shock of realizing what they had just been capable of. The real choice you faced was not whether to press the button. It was a choice between two authorities, two forces battling for control. On one side, the loud, external authority, the man in the white lab coat, representing science, duty, and the prestige of Yale University. On the other side, the quiet, internal authority, the almost silent signal of empathy, the whisper of conscience, barely audible over the generator's hum. Stop. You are hurting someone. The entire Milgram experiment is not really a test of cruelty. It is an audiological test, a test of sensitivity to the voice of conscience amidst extreme background noise. Whose voice will be louder for you? Now that the set has been dismantled and the actors have gone home, Milgram's mirror is turned toward you. Imagine for a moment the cold, smooth surface of the button under your finger. Hear the confident command of the experimenter and the desperate cry from behind the wall. Now answer with absolute honesty, at least to yourself. If you were in that room, what would you write in the final report about your own actions? Did you obey authority? Or did you listen to your conscience? This experiment is not over. It continues right now in every decision you make.